Why a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia is almost impossible. If you've been following the news lately, one topic keeps coming up: the peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. Russia launched a full-scale military attack on Ukraine in February 2022. Since then, people have been talking about a possible peace deal. For a while, it seemed impossible, but now the Trump administration is trying to push one through. While campaigning for his second presidency in 2024, Donald Trump said he could end the war in 24 hours. Anyone who knows even a little about war and diplomacy knows that's impossible. No war ends in 24 hours, unless one side suffers a dramatic defeat. Even Trump later admitted he was exaggerating. Now, let's break down the deal. What does each side want, and is a compromise even possible?
What does Russia want? President Putin seems to want the maximum. Keep all the territories Russian forces occupy, force Ukraine to reduce its military, and prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. It's reminiscent of the Treaty of Versailles. After losing World War I, Germany was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which required Germany to cede territories to the Allied countries, limit the size of its military, and pay war reparations. The German administration that signed the treaty was labeled the November criminals by the German people. Hitler and his Nazi party exploited this resentment to gain popular support in their bid for power, and they were ultimately successful. If Zelensky's administration were to agree to such a deal, they would risk being labeled as traitors by their political opponents, and Zelensky might be forced to resign. Remember, his presidential term officially ended in May 2024. A presidential election has been postponed because of the war, and his opponents could use this as an excuse to call for a new election and push him out. Zelensky is aware of this, and he would probably never sign such a deal.
What does Ukraine want? Ukraine wants Russia to withdraw from all occupied territories, including Crimea and Donbass, and retain the right to join NATO. If Putin agreed to that, it would be political suicide for him. So any deal would have to fall somewhere in the middle. But where exactly is that middle? The Trump administration is reportedly pushing for a deal where Ukraine cedes some territory to Russia and gives up NATO membership. In return, Ukraine would receive security guarantees from the US and NATO, essentially that an attack on Ukraine would be treated as an attack on the whole transatlantic community. If Ukraine cedes land, it would likely be Crimea and Donbass. Before the Soviet Union was formed, Crimea was part of the Russian Empire. After Ukraine became part of the Soviet Union, the Soviet government transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1954. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine declared independence, Crimea was part of Ukraine, recognized as such by Russia and the international community. From the Russian perspective, Crimea belongs to Russia because it was part of Russia before 1954. From the Ukrainian perspective, however, Crimea has been part of Ukraine since then and was recognized by Russia and the international community. Any deal requiring one side to cede this land to the other would be extremely difficult to achieve. The Donbass region has a longer tie with Ukraine, but with a majority of people who speak Russian and tend to lean toward Russia, it is also difficult to reach a compromise. What about the security guarantees? Do they actually provide Ukraine with real security? Can Ukraine trust them? In 1991, when Ukraine broke away from the Soviet Union, it inherited a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons. The United States and other Western nations, fearing that these weapons might fall into the wrong hands or misused, offered Ukraine security assurances in exchange for transferring all its nuclear warheads to Russia. One of the terms of these assurances was that the signatory countries would refrain from the threat or use of force against Ukraine. Who were the countries that signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994? They were the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. Despite signing the memorandum, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. This clearly shows why Ukraine cannot fully trust any security guarantees offered by other countries. The United States has a history of abandoning its allies when its interests in helping them fade. In 1973, when the United States signed the Paris Peace Accords with Communist North Vietnam to withdraw its troops from Vietnam, hoping to end the Vietnam War, President Richard Nixon gave the government of South Vietnam assurances that the United States would intervene if North Vietnam attacked. Nixon promised severe retaliatory action, including renewed U.S. airstrikes. South Vietnam was told it would not be abandoned, but abandoned it was.
When North Vietnam launched a military campaign to take over South Vietnam in 1975, the United States did not intervene. President Nixon had resigned in 1974 after the Watergate scandal. His vice president, Gerald Ford, who took office afterward, refused to help South Vietnam. South Vietnam fell into communist hands in April 1975. In 2001, the United States sent troops to Afghanistan, primarily in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks, with the immediate goal of destroying al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban regime that was protecting it. After the Taliban was removed from power, a new democratic Afghan government was formed. The United States continued to combat the Taliban insurgency for the next 2 decades while helping the Afghan government rebuild its economy and military. In 2020, under Donald Trump's administration, the United States signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, despite repeated warnings from its allies that such an agreement would put the Afghan democratic government at risk. Under this agreement, U.S. and NATO troops were scheduled to leave Afghanistan within 14 months. In August 2021, the Taliban toppled the Afghan government and took control of the country, even though the U.S. military had not yet fully withdrawn. Now, with the security guarantees given to Ukraine, there is no certainty that a future U.S. administration would honor them. The United States changes administrations every 4 years, and each new administration reshapes U.S. policies in its own way. Any guarantee given by a previous administration can be reinterpreted to fit the current administration's policy. This means what is promised to Ukraine today may be interpreted differently by future U.S. administrations. Similarly, agreements signed by Russia's current government could be disregarded by a future government, just as they did with the Budapest Memorandum. Even if President Zelensky were to take a leap of faith and accept such a deal, there is one major hurdle it would have to clear: a national referendum. Ukraine is a democratic country, and any agreement that shapes the future of the nation must be broadly accepted by its population. This represents a major obstacle that cannot be ignored. In the 19th century, China's Qing dynasty made numerous concessions to foreign powers, resulting in the loss of sovereignty over parts of the country. These concessions caused the Qing dynasty to lose legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese people and became part of the national trauma known as the Century of Humiliation. Historically, no nation willingly accepts a deal that gives away its land to another country unless it has been defeated militarily. Ukraine has not been defeated. The Ukrainian people still believe they can win the war. Any deal that cedes land to Russia would be widely seen as a betrayal. No leader wants to go down in history as a traitor, least of all Zelensky. At present, the Trump administration appears optimistic about the prospect of a peace deal. Steve Witkoff, a businessman with no significant political experience, is leading the effort. He seems to approach the negotiations as a business transaction,
largely disregarding national pride, historical ties, and human emotion. For him, the appearance of a deal appears more important than the political realities on the ground. Trump himself approaches negotiations in a similar way. So, if you ask, if a peace deal is not possible, what happens next? The answer is simple. Ukraine must continue to fight until it achieves the outcome it seeks. History is a harsh judge. It shows no leniency. If you do not fight and sacrifice, you lose.